What if the love of your life was hidden in the most unexpected place, waiting at the edge of your exhaustion, after your longest journey, at a simple well in a foreign land? Please note that, love is sweet, love is patient. On that faithful day, Jacob had left home, not in triumph, but in fear. His brother Esau was burning with vengeance after Jacob, through deceit and strategy, took his birthright and blessing. With his mother Rebekah's urgent warning, Jacob fled the land of Canaan and journeyed north to the land of his uncle Laban in Haran. He was alone, uncertain, and afraid of what lay ahead. This was not the journey of a conqueror, but the pilgrimage of a man marked by both calling and consequence. Days turned into weeks. The heat of the wilderness pressed against his strength. But just when he thought the road had nothing more to offer, Jacob lifted his eyes, and saw a well. It was there, at that simple well outside Haran, that something extraordinary happened. As Jacob approached, he saw shepherds gathered, waiting to water their flocks. They told him they were from Haran, and even more, they knew Laban, the man Jacob was seeking. Then, almost as if divinely timed, a young woman appeared, graceful, radiant, and strong. She was leading her father's sheep with the confidence of a seasoned shepherdess. Her name was Rachel. And in that moment, Jacob's heart shifted. The weariness of his journey faded in the presence of destiny. Rachel was not just beautiful, she carried a presence that stirred something deep in Jacob's soul. He moved the stone from the well's mouth, an act of unusual strength, and watered her sheep. Then he wept. Yes, the man who had deceived his father, fled from his brother, and traveled miles through barren land, was now undone by love. Not a fleeting feeling, but a sense of divine appointment. He kissed her, introduced himself as the son of Rebekah, and she ran to tell her father. When Laban heard the news, he welcomed Jacob with open arms, calling him, "my own flesh and blood." And so Jacob was taken into the household of the very man whose daughter had just captivated his heart. But what began at the well was only the beginning. This was not just a meeting. It was the unfolding of one of the greatest love stories in all of Scripture, a tale of passion, patience, betrayal, and faith. The well had become a threshold, and Rachel had become a promise. Jacob had found more than water that day, he had found purpose. And though he did not yet know it, the cost of love would stretch him, test him, and ultimately shape the future of an entire nation. So, dear viewer, please declare this with me: like Jacob, I will not stop at the well of weariness. I believe love, purpose, and divine encounters await me on the other side of obedience. I choose to keep walking. Because destiny meets the faithful. What would you be willing to endure for the one your soul loves? Would you wait 7 years? Would you labor in silence, with no guarantee, only hope? For Jacob, the answer was yes. After being welcomed into Laban's home, Jacob stayed a full month. But his heart was already set, he loved Rachel. Not with fleeting passion, but with a steady, burning desire rooted in purpose. So when Laban finally asked what wages Jacob desired for his work, the response came without hesitation: "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Genesis 29 verse 18, NKJV, 7 years. In our modern minds, that may sound unreasonable, even extreme. But Jacob wasn't calculating time, he was sowing into love. His offer was bold and clear. He didn't ask to earn her through shortcuts or manipulation. He was willing to labor. Willing to wait. Willing to trust. Scripture says. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. Genesis 29 verse 20, NKJV, think about that. 7 years felt like days. Time lost its weight under the presence of true love. Jacob's work was not casual. He was tending sheep, enduring harsh conditions, battling the heat by day and the cold by night. But every hour was redeemed by one thought: Rachel. His love gave meaning to his labor. His patience became a quiet testimony of devotion. This chapter in Jacob's life speaks powerfully to us today. In a world obsessed with speed and instant gratification, Jacob's story reminds us that real love waits. True commitment costs something. And what is rooted in the will of God is often refined in the fire of time. His 7-year service was more than a bride price, it was a preparation of his own heart. The Lord was not only leading him to Rachel, but teaching him to become the man worthy of her. Love is not proven in moments, it is proven in seasons. How many give up when the wait becomes too long? How many settle for substitutes when the real thing takes too much time? But Jacob held fast. His eyes were fixed. His hands worked. And his heart stayed hopeful. These years shaped him. They tested his resolve. And they foreshadowed something even deeper. That God often fulfills his greatest promises only after we've learned to persevere. So if you're waiting, if you're laboring for something God has placed in your heart, don't lose hope. Jacob's 7 years remind us, love is patient, and when it is grounded in faith, even long seasons of labor can feel like moments in the eyes of eternity. Have you ever waited faithfully for something, only to be handed the opposite of what you were promised? What do you do when betrayal shows up in the place of blessing? Jacob had waited 7 long years. Each day spent working in the fields brought him closer to the moment he would finally marry Rachel, the woman he loved, the one he had sacrificed for. The day of the wedding finally arrived. The feast was prepared. The music rose. The celebration echoed through the air. And as the sun set, Jacob's joy was full. That night, under the cover of darkness and veils, the bride was brought to him. Jacob welcomed her, believing that love had triumphed. But when the morning light pierced the tent, the truth was revealed, so it came to pass in the morning, that behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" Genesis 29 verse 25, NKJV, Jacob was crushed. Betrayed. The same man who once deceived his own father by pretending to be his brother was now deceived by his father-in-law, who gave him Rachel's older sister Leah instead. Laban's justification was cold and calculated, it must not be done so in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Genesis 29 verse 26, NKJV, and just like that, Jacob found himself bound to a woman he had not chosen. This moment in Jacob's life is jarring. It's the collision between expectation and reality, between human desire and divine process. God was still present, but not everything was unfolding according to Jacob's plan. Here we see a principle echoed throughout Scripture: God often works through disappointment to shape destiny. What Jacob didn't realize was that this bitter moment would play a role in birthing the 12 tribes of Israel. But for now, it just hurt. Instead of rejoicing with Rachel, Jacob had to endure the pain of broken trust, public embarrassment, and delayed fulfillment. Have you ever experienced that? When your faithfulness doesn't seem to be rewarded. When you've held on in obedience, but life still hands you confusion. Jacob's story reminds us, even the righteous can be wounded by injustice. But that's not the end. God was not finished. Despite the betrayal, Jacob did not abandon the promise. He confronted Laban, and Laban proposed a new deal: fulfill her week, Leah's bridal week, and then he could also marry Rachel, in exchange for 7 more years of labor. Jacob agreed. Yes, betrayal entered the wedding, but faith did not leave the man. What happens when love becomes a battlefield, and the closest bond, sisterhood, is torn apart by rivalry? Jacob, still reeling from Laban's deception, agreed to fulfill Leah's bridal week. And just 7 days later, Rachel was given to him as a second wife. But the union came at a high price: another 7 years of labor, and the brewing of a painful rivalry between 2 sisters. What began as a love story had now turned into a house divided. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't subtle. It was written into the air of the home. Rachel was his chosen one, his beloved. Leah, on the other hand, was the unwanted bride. Given by trickery. Married in darkness. Living in the shadow of her younger sister. But God saw Leah's pain. Scripture declares, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Genesis 29 verse 31, NKJV, Leah began to bear children. One after another, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And with each birth, she gave voice to her soul's ache, now my husband will love me. Genesis 29 verse 32, NKJV, she longed for affection. She desired to be seen, not just by man, but by the one who shared her roof and her pain. But her fruitfulness did not remove the emptiness. And Rachel's barrenness did not diminish her favor in Jacob's eyes. This chapter of Scripture is heavy with emotion, jealousy, rejection, silent tears, and unspoken comparisons. Two sisters. Tied by blood, yet pulled apart by the same man. Rachel had love but no children. Leah had children but no love. Neither was fully content. Both were silently competing for something they believed would complete them. And Jacob, though chosen by God and blessed with destiny, found himself in the middle of a growing storm. What we see here is more than family tension. It's the consequence of human manipulation, broken trust, and misplaced hope. Laban's decision to substitute Leah not only wounded Jacob, it fractured his daughter's peace and forever altered the course of their lives. Yet even in the mess, God was moving. He heard Leah's cry. He remembered Rachel's longing. He was writing a greater story through their struggle. This chapter reminds us that even in divided homes and difficult relationships, God does not withdraw his presence. He sees. He hears. He knows. The broken sisterhood would never fully heal in their lifetime, but their children, born through pain, hope, and divine purpose, would become the foundation of Israel's future. What do you do when your heart is full of love, but your arms remain empty? When the thing you long for most never seems to come, even while others receive it freely? Rachel knew she was loved by Jacob, but it wasn't enough. Her sister Leah had already borne 4 sons, and Rachel had none. The silence of her womb became deafening. The joy of her marriage was overshadowed by a slow, painful ache that only a woman longing for a child can understand. And in her desperation, Rachel turned not to prayer, but to her husband. With anguish in her voice, she cried out, "Give me children, or else I die." Genesis 30 verse 1. But Jacob was frustrated. He knew the source of life was not in his power. He responded sharply, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Genesis 30 verse 2. This moment reveals something deeply human. Even in a household chosen by God, even among people of promise, there was pain, pressure, and spiritual tension. Rachel, like many women in Scripture before her, Sarah, Rebecca, Hannah, faced the crushing reality of barrenness. But instead of waiting on God's timing, she chose a different path. One that reflected the customs of her time, but not the perfect will of God. She offered her maidservant, Bilhah, to Jacob. Her thinking was clear, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. So Bilhah became Rachel's surrogate, and she bore 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Rachel claimed them as her own, even though she had not conceived them. In naming Naphtali, she said, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." Genesis 30 verse 8. This was not just about motherhood, it was about competition. A rivalry between sisters had turned into a war of the womb. Rachel's desperation reveals a spiritual truth: when we strive in our own strength to fulfill what only God can give, we invite sorrow, confusion, and rivalry. She had Jacob's heart, but she wanted more. She wanted fruitfulness, legacy, validation. But fruitfulness never comes through manipulation, it comes through surrender. And yet, even in her flawed decision, God was merciful. He did not abandon her. He did not shame her. He allowed the process to unfold, but the promise was not forgotten. Barrenness, whether physical, spiritual, or emotional, can drive us to a breaking point. But Rachel's story reminds us, God sees the cry behind our striving. He hears the pain hidden behind our plans. In time, He would remember her. But first, she would have to walk through the valley of desperation. What happens when family becomes a battlefield, and children become tokens in a war of pride, pain, and silent power? The house of Jacob, once full of promise, had now become a stage for rivalry. Rachel, desperate to have children, had already given her maidservant Bilhah to Jacob. Through Bilhah, 2 sons had been born, Dan and Naphtali. Rachel counted them as her own, believing she had gained ground against her sister. But Leah, watching her sister's plan succeed, refused to be left behind. Though she had already borne 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Leah had ceased bearing children. So she, too, gave her maidservant Zilpah to Jacob, hoping to reclaim her advantage. And Zilpah bore a son, Gad. A troop comes. Leah declared. Genesis 30 verse 11. Soon, Zilpah bore another, Asher. Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. Genesis 30 verse 13. But behind these joyful names were aching hearts. The 2 sisters were locked in a quiet war. A war where children became symbols of status, and love was measured in numbers. Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes, had now fathered 8 sons, 6 by Leah and her maid, 2 by Rachel's maid. And yet, the family was not united in joy. Instead, it was divided by insecurity, rivalry, and the thirst for approval. What was meant to be sacred, childbirth, motherhood, covenant, had been wrapped in human striving. The use of maidservants, while culturally acceptable at the time, reveals something deeper, the temptation to use human solutions to fix spiritual delays. Rachel and Leah both believed that having children would win them something, either love or honor. But neither received the peace they truly desired. The names of these children, though celebratory, carry undertones of conflict. Dan, God has judged; Naphtali, my struggle; Gad, a troop comes; Asher. Happy, they were born from a house divided, not just into tribes, but into camps of longing and pain. Yet, in all this, God remained at work. He did not abandon the household. He allowed history to unfold, knowing that even through brokenness, His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob, would be fulfilled. What we learn here is sobering. When people compete for what only God can give, they may win battles but still lose peace. Rachel and Leah were not evil, they were human. Women shaped by their time, scarred by comparison, and desperate to be seen. Their story mirrors our own moments of striving, when we try to force outcomes instead of trusting God's pace. But God had not forgotten either of them. The children born during this turbulent time would carry the seeds of nations. Because even in the chaos of human emotion, God writes His story. Have you ever tried to bargain for a blessing? Tried to trade, manipulate, or negotiate your way into what only God can give? The tension between Rachel and Leah had not eased, it had only shifted. Each woman had now given children to Jacob, either through their own womb or through their maidservants. But the ache for more lingered, especially for Rachel, who still had not conceived a child of her own. Then came an unusual moment, one that revealed just how desperate both sisters had become. One day, Leah's eldest son, Reuben, went out into the fields during the wheat harvest and found mandrakes, a fruit believed in ancient times to enhance fertility. He brought them to his mother. When Rachel saw the mandrakes, she immediately asked Leah for some. But Leah, weary of always feeling like the unwanted one, responded sharply, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Genesis 30:15. Rachel, who had Jacob's heart but no children, was now seeking mandrakes in hopes of unlocking her womb. Leah, who had Jacob's children but not his affection, felt she had nothing left to give. So Rachel made a trade, a deal born from desperation. Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. Genesis 30 verse 15, continued, and so, for one night, Leah reclaimed Jacob's presence, and that very night, Leah conceived again. She bore Issachar, then Zebulun, and later a daughter, Dinah. Rachel, despite securing the mandrakes, still remained barren. This moment is filled with irony. Rachel received the supposed fertility fruit, but Leah received the actual child. Because the power to conceive was never in the mandrake, it was in the hand of God. And yet, this exchange shows us how easily we lean on earthly solutions when heaven seems silent. Rachel was trying everything: servants, bargains, herbal remedies. Everything except surrender. Leah, though wounded and weary, was still being remembered by God. And here lies the deeper lesson: human schemes cannot unlock divine timing. The mandrake bargain teaches us that blessings do not come through manipulation. They come through mercy. The womb is not opened by fruit, but by favor. This story is not about fertility alone, it's about faith. It's about the subtle ways we trade our peace, our integrity, even our joy, trying to control outcomes only God can orchestrate. But the silence would not last forever. God was watching. God was waiting. And soon, he would act, not because of mandrakes, not because of trades, but because of love. What if the silence from heaven is not a rejection, but a preparation? What if the delay is not denial, but divine timing? Rachel had waited, and waited. She watched Leah bear 6 sons. She endured the cries of newborns that were not her own. She tasted the bitterness of being loved, yet unfulfilled. For years, her womb remained closed. The mandrakes had failed her. The surrogacy had not satisfied her longing. And hope began to flicker like a flame in the wind. But then, after years of silent sorrow, the breakthrough came. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Genesis 30 verse 22. Let those words sink in. God remembered Rachel. He had never forgotten her. Not for a moment. The God who formed her had been watching, waiting, and preparing the right time for his promise. Rachel conceived and gave birth to a son. And she called his name Joseph, and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." Genesis 30 verse 24. Joseph. His name means, "May he add." Even in her joy, Rachel was still longing, still believing for more. But this child wasn't just a personal victory, it was a prophetic beginning. Joseph would become the favored son. The dreamer. The one destined to rise from the pit to the palace and preserve nations in a time of famine. But before all that, he was simply the answer to a mother's prayer. Rachel's story reminds us that God's delays are not God's denials. When he remembers, he acts. And when he opens a door, no man can shut it. This moment teaches us that God hears the silent prayers of the brokenhearted. God sees the tears that fall when no one else is watching. God honors those who wait, even when it feels like they're forgotten. Rachel's waiting was long, but not wasted. Her womb, once closed, became the vessel of a nation's future. Joseph's birth marked the turning of a page not just for her, but for Jacob's entire family. We often cry, "Lord, remember me." But the truth is, he always does. In his perfect time. In his perfect way. In a moment that rewrites years of sorrow. Rachel's life would still face heartbreak ahead, but for now, she held her son. And with him, a promise fulfilled. What do you do when joy is met by tragedy? When the long-awaited promise comes, only to cost more than you ever imagined? Rachel, once barren, now held the joy of her son Joseph in her arms. Her heart, once weighed down with longing, had tasted the sweetness of motherhood. But her journey was not yet over. Time passed. Jacob's household grew. And eventually, the day came when God told Jacob to return to the land of his fathers. Then God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Genesis 35 verse 1. Jacob obeyed. He gathered his family, his wives, his children, and his flocks, and they set out on the long journey back to Canaan. Along the way, Rachel became pregnant again. This was the second child she had longed for, the one she had hinted at when naming Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son. But the road to Canaan would not be paved with joy alone. As they traveled from Bethel toward Ephrath, on a rugged path far from safety, Rachel went into labor. It was not an ordinary labor. It was hard. It was severe. And the closer she came to delivery, the clearer it became, this would be her final battle. Now it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, she had hard labor. And, as her soul was departing, for she died, she called his name Benoni, Genesis 35 verses 16 to 18. Benoni, son of my sorrow. Those were Rachel's last words, uttered with her final breath. A name drenched in pain, in suffering, and in the shattering of hope. But Jacob, grieving yet resolute, renamed the boy, but his father called him Benjamin. Genesis 35 verse 18. Benjamin, son of the right hand. It was a shift from sorrow to strength. From loss to legacy. From death to destiny. Rachel died on the road, not in a home, not surrounded by comfort, but in the midst of the journey. And Jacob, broken-hearted, buried her there, just outside Bethlehem. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Genesis 35 verses 19 to 20. Even in death, Rachel remained set apart. She was the only matriarch not buried in the family tomb at Machpelah. Her grave stood by the road, a silent witness to love, loss, and the high cost of promise. Centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah would write, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Jeremiah 31 verse 15. Rachel's story echoed through time. Her weeping became a symbol of Israel's sorrow, and her life, a reminder that sometimes, the path to destiny is paved with pain. But Rachel's legacy did not end at the grave. She bore Joseph, the preserver of nations. She bore Benjamin, the tribe from which kings and warriors would rise. She bore sorrow, but she also bore strength. Can a life cut short still leave a lasting legacy? Can a woman who died in sorrow be remembered for strength, for promise, for prophecy? Rachel's story ended not with celebration, but with burial. On the journey to Ephrath, she gave her life bringing Benjamin into the world. And there, on that dusty road, Jacob set up a stone, a memorial to the woman he loved more than any other. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Genesis 35 verse 20. Rachel was not buried in the family tomb of Machpelah, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah would all rest. Instead, Rachel's tomb stood alone, by the road to Bethlehem. And though her body was laid in sorrow, her memory was woven into the soul of Israel. Generations later, when Babylonian soldiers tore Israel's children from their homes, marching them into exile, the prophet Jeremiah wrote, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because they are no more. Jeremiah 31 verse 15. Rachel became the symbol of a grieving mother. Her tears echoed through Israel's darkest hours. Her tomb, on the road to Bethlehem, stood not just as a grave, but as a witness. And in the New Testament, those same words reappear. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children. Matthew 2 verses 17 to 18. It was spoken in the days when Herod ordered the slaughter of infants in Bethlehem, trying to destroy the promised Messiah. Once again, Rachel's weeping was remembered. But do not miss the beauty hidden in the pain. Rachel's tomb became a place of memory and pilgrimage. Her name lived on in the hearts of a nation. And the children she bore, Joseph and Benjamin, formed tribes that shaped history. Joseph preserved Israel in Egypt. Benjamin gave rise to King Saul, Queen Esther's family line, and the Apostle Paul. Her legacy was not buried, it was multiplied. Rachel teaches us that a life doesn't have to be long to be meaningful. That sorrow and significance often walk hand in hand. That the ones who cry the deepest tears are often the ones God uses to birth the greatest legacies. And so, though she died young, Rachel lives on. In the scriptures. In the history of Israel. In the echoes of every promise birthed through pain. Rachel's life reminds us that love is powerful, waiting is painful, and God's timing is always perfect. Though her journey was marked by longing and loss, her legacy remains eternal. If this story moved your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to spread these forgotten truths. Share it with someone who needs to know that God remembers, even in silence. And subscribe to Hidden Bible Stories Unveiled for more timeless stories like this, where every chapter holds a message, and every woman matters. If you love this story, please support in the comments section. God will remember you like He remembered Rachel. Because your story, just like Rachel's, is not over yet.